After World War II ended in 1945, the world was a very different place. The war had destroyed many cities, and millions of people had lost their lives. However, even though the fighting stopped, peace was still far from being a certainty. The world seemed to be divided. On one side, there were the Western countries, led by the United States. On the other side, there was the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. These two powers were very different in many ways, and this created fear and uncertainty. The Soviet Union in the East was becoming stronger. Stalin had control over many countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And these countries were either controlled by the Soviet government or had governments that were loyal to the Soviet Union. For the people living in these countries, life was difficult. Some people saw Soviet control as a way to bring order and stability. They called it liberation. However, many others saw it as a form of occupation. They were unhappy with the Soviet control and wanted to be free. On the other side of Europe, the Western countries were worried. They were scared that the Soviet Union would try to take over more countries. The Soviet Union had the biggest army in the world, and Stalin was a strong and unpredictable leader. The leaders of the United States, Britain, and France were not sure how to deal with the Soviet Union. They had just come out of the horrors of World War II, and no one wanted another war. But at the same time, they knew they had to stop the Soviet Union from spreading its control further. In 1949, the United States, along with Canada and many European countries, formed a new military alliance called NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The idea behind NATO was simple. The leaders of these countries made a promise. If one country is attacked, all the others will help defend it. This was meant to protect the countries of Western Europe from the Soviet Union. NATO wanted to show the Soviet Union that they were not afraid, and that they would stand together to protect their freedom. But the Soviet Union did not like NATO. They saw it as a threat. In response, the Soviet Union formed its own military alliance in 1955 called the Warsaw Pact. This was an alliance of the Soviet Union and its Eastern European countries. The world was now divided into two main groups. On one side, there were the democratic countries of the West, which were part of NATO. On the other side, there were the communist countries of the East, which were part of the Warsaw Pact. Both sides were preparing for a fight, even though neither wanted an actual war. One of the first big problems came in Berlin, the capital of Germany. After the war, Germany had been divided into two parts: East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Germany, which was controlled by the Western countries. Berlin was also divided into two parts, with East Berlin controlled by the Soviet Union and West Berlin controlled by the Western countries. In 1948, Stalin decided to cut off all roads leading into West Berlin, hoping that the Western countries would give up. He wanted to force them out of the city. This was called the Berlin Blockade. However, the people in West Berlin didn't give up. The United States and its allies decided to send food, medicine, and other supplies to the people in West Berlin by air. This was called the Berlin Airlift. Every day, hundreds of planes flew into the city, bringing supplies to the people trapped inside. The Soviet Union tried to stop the planes, but they couldn't. After almost a year, the Soviet Union gave up, and the blockade was lifted. It was a victory for the Western countries and a clear message to the Soviet Union. NATO would stand firm and would not be bullied. This event, the Berlin Airlift, showed the world that NATO was strong. It also made the Soviet Union realize that the West was not going to back down. The Cold War had begun. There would be no fighting in the traditional sense with tanks and soldiers, but instead, it would be a war of words, ideas, and fear. Both sides would try to outsmart and outlast each other. The tension was high, and no one knew how this conflict would end. The world was divided, and the Cold War would continue to shape history for many years to come. This was just the beginning of a long period of tension and competition between the East and the West. The Cold War would change how nations thought about war and peace, and how countries prepared for the future. The world had entered a new kind of battle, one that did not involve traditional warfare but the constant threat of it. As time passed after the end of World War II, the world continued to change. The Soviet Union was growing stronger, and the West was becoming more concerned. The Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe was expanding, and many people in the West were worried about the possibility of the Soviet Union spreading even further. NATO, which was formed in 1949 to protect Western countries, began to grow. The idea behind NATO was simple. If one NATO country was attacked, all the other countries would help protect it. This was meant to create a strong defense against any potential Soviet threat. The Western countries were afraid that the Soviet Union might try to take over more countries in Europe, so they formed NATO to prevent this from happening. The United States, Canada, and many European countries joined NATO. They believed that by working together, they could stop the spread of communism and protect their way of life. The principle of NATO was clear. An attack on one is an attack on all. This meant that if any country in NATO was attacked, the others would come to its defense. This unity made NATO a strong military force that could stand up to the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union saw NATO as a threat. They were not happy with the idea of so many countries joining together against them. In response, the Soviet Union formed their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The Warsaw Pact was made up of the Soviet Union and several countries in Eastern Europe that were controlled by the Soviets. The Warsaw Pact was meant to counter NATO and protect the Soviet Union from any possible attack from the West. Now the world was divided into two sides. NATO was on one side, and the Warsaw Pact was on the other. The two sides had different ideas and different systems of government. NATO supported democracy, while the Warsaw Pact supported communism. These two groups were in constant competition with each other. It was not a war with guns and bombs, but a battle of power, influence, and ideas. Both sides wanted to control more land, have more power, and spread their way of life. One of the most dangerous parts of this period was the arms race. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact began building nuclear weapons. Each side wanted to have more powerful bombs than the other. This created a lot of fear because everyone knew that if either side used these bombs, it could destroy the world. This fear of nuclear war became known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was that if one side used a nuclear weapon, the other side would do the same, and both sides would be destroyed. So, even though the two sides were building more and more weapons, neither side actually wanted to use them. It was a strange kind of peace based on fear. NATO also began focusing on intelligence and spying. Since the Cold War was not a war with soldiers and tanks, both sides relied on spies to gather information and find out what the other side was planning. The United States and the Soviet Union both had secret agents working in each other's countries. These spies tried to learn secrets and find weaknesses. The Cold War was fought with information and secrets, not just with armies. This new kind of warfare changed the way both sides viewed each other. It was no longer just about armies and weapons, but about knowledge and who could control the most information. The 1950s and 1960s were full of tension. While the Soviet Union continued to grow, NATO stayed strong, using its military power and intelligence to prevent Soviet expansion. Even though both sides had large armies and powerful weapons, there was no direct war. The Cold War was a fight of ideas, and each side tried to show that their system of government was better than the other. The West believed in democracy, while the East believed in communism. The world watched, hoping that neither side would make a mistake that could lead to a world war. NATO's growth made the Soviet Union nervous. They were worried that NATO would continue to expand and try to take control of more countries. To stop this, the Soviet Union worked hard to keep Eastern Europe under its control. However, the West continued to try and help countries in Eastern Europe that were under Soviet control. These countries wanted freedom, and the West wanted to support them in any way possible. In the end, NATO's growth showed that the West was committed to protecting its countries and values. While the Soviet Union fought back by strengthening its alliance, the world remained in a tense standoff. The two sides watched each other closely, each side building its military strength. But neither side wanted to start a war. The Cold War continued, and NATO's role in keeping the peace became even more important. The tension would not go away, but NATO had proven that it could stand strong against the Soviet Union and its influence. The world changed a lot after the end of the Cold War. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and many of the countries that were once controlled by the Soviets gained their independence. These countries, which had lived under Soviet rule for so many years, wanted to be part of the Western world. Many of them looked to NATO for protection. They wanted to join the alliance to ensure their safety and security. For them, NATO was a symbol of freedom and safety from any future threats, especially from Russia. As NATO grew, it faced new challenges. The alliance was no longer just about stopping the spread of communism. The world was now dealing with new problems, and NATO had to adapt to meet these challenges. One of the biggest challenges NATO faced was terrorism. After the attacks on September 11, 2001, when terrorists from the group Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, the world changed. It was no longer about fighting a war against a country or a group of soldiers. Now, the enemy was different. It was an enemy that did not have a country, an army, or a clear leader. Terrorists hide in many places, and their attacks can come without warning. NATO had to change the way it worked. The alliance had been focused on defending Europe from the Soviet Union, but now it was fighting against terrorists in faraway places like Afghanistan. The United States led this new fight, and NATO joined in, marking the first time NATO fought a war outside of Europe. NATO's mission in Afghanistan was not easy. It was a difficult war against people who did not have a regular army. NATO's soldiers had to deal with bombings, hidden enemies, and difficult terrain. It was a new kind of war, one that NATO had never faced before. While NATO was fighting terrorism, it also had to deal with another growing problem: cyber attacks. In the modern world, countries are not just fighting each other with weapons. Now, they can attack each other using the internet. Hackers can break into a country's computer systems and cause damage without ever setting foot on that country's soil. These cyber attacks can target a country's government, economy, and even its military. NATO had to adapt to this new type of threat by strengthening its ability to defend against cyber attacks. It worked with its members to build better cybersecurity systems and trained soldiers to understand how to fight in the digital world. Another challenge for NATO came from inside the alliance itself. As NATO grew, some members began to question the alliance's role. The world had changed, and some people wondered if NATO was still necessary. The world was no longer divided into two clear sides, as it had been during the Cold War. Many former Soviet countries had joined NATO, and there were no longer any direct threats from the Soviet Union. Some people began to ask, is NATO still needed? NATO had to answer this question and find a way to remain relevant. The alliance had to prove that it could still help protect its members in a changing world. In addition to dealing with terrorism and cyber attacks, NATO also began to help with humanitarian missions, such as disaster relief and peacekeeping. NATO's role in the world was no longer just about military defense. It became more about promoting peace and stability in different parts of the world. However, NATO's challenges did not end there. In recent years, Russia has become a problem again. While the Soviet Union is no more, Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, has been growing more powerful. Russia has been challenging NATO in places like Ukraine, where Russia took control of Crimea in 2014. This created new tensions between NATO and Russia. Many NATO countries were worried about Russia's growing influence in Europe, and some feared that Russia might try to take over other countries in Eastern Europe. NATO had to respond to these new challenges. It increased its military presence in Eastern Europe, especially in countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. NATO's members wanted to show Russia that they would not allow it to take over any more countries. They also wanted to send a message to the world that NATO was still strong and still committed to defending its members. The rise of China also presents new challenges for NATO. As China becomes more powerful, it is beginning to challenge the United States and its allies in new ways. China's growing military power and influence around the world are creating new concerns for NATO. Many countries are wondering how NATO should respond to China's rise and what role NATO will play in the Asia-Pacific region. Despite these challenges, NATO remains a strong and important alliance. It has adapted to meet the needs of the modern world. While NATO's original purpose was to defend Europe from the Soviet Union, it now plays a larger role in global security. It faces many challenges, from terrorism to cyber attacks to rising tensions with Russia and China. But NATO continues to be a powerful force for peace and stability in the world. The alliance's ability to adapt and work together with other countries is what makes it so strong, even in today's rapidly changing world. Throughout the story of NATO, we have seen how this alliance grew from a simple defense pact into a powerful force for peace and security. From its beginnings during the Cold War, NATO faced many challenges, including the fear of nuclear war, the threat of terrorism, and even cyber attacks. But through it all, NATO adapted and stood strong, teaching us the importance of unity and cooperation. It showed us that when we work together, we can overcome even the toughest challenges. The most important lesson from this story is that we must be ready to adapt to change. NATO had to adjust its strategies over time, and in the same way, we must also be flexible in our lives. Life is always changing, and we can grow stronger by facing new challenges with a positive attitude and the support of others. Congratulations for improving your English listening skills through this story. You have done a great job. What lesson from NATO's story do you find most important? A. The importance of unity. B. The importance of adapting to change. Please comment on your answer, A or B, below. We would love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep making helpful content for you. Also, consider donating to help us keep producing high-quality content. We are working hard to provide this service for free, and your donation will allow us to continue. Thank you.